The Lady with the Little Dog by Anton Chekov. The talk was that a new face had appeared on the embankment. A lady with a little dog. Dmitry Dmitrich Gurov, who had already spent 2 weeks in Yalta and was used to it, also began to take an interest in new faces. Sitting in a pavilion at Vernay's, he saw a young woman, not very tall, blonde, in a beret, walking along the embankment. Behind her ran a white Spitz. And after that, he met her several times a day in the town garden or in the square. She went strolling around in the same beret with the white Spitz. No one knew who she was, and they simply called her the Lady with the Little Dog. If she's here with no husband or friends, Gurov reflected, it wouldn't be a bad idea to make her acquaintance. He was not yet 40, but he had a 12-year-old daughter and 2 sons in school. He had married young, while still a second-year student, and now his wife seemed half again his age. She was a tall woman with dark eyebrows, erect, imposing, dignified, and a thinking person, as she called herself. She read a great deal, used the new orthography, called her husband not Dmitri, but Dimitri, but he secretly considered her none too bright, narrow-minded, graceless, was afraid of her, disliked being at home. He had begun to be unfaithful to her long ago, was unfaithful often, and probably for that reason almost always spoke ill of women. And when they were discussed in his presence, he would say of them, an inferior race. It seemed to him that he had been taught enough by bitter experience to call them anything he liked, and yet he could not have lived without the inferior race, not even for 2 days. In the company of men he was bored, ill at ease, and with them he was taciturn and cold, but when he was among women he felt himself free and knew what to talk about with them and how to behave, and he was at ease even being silent with them. In his appearance, in his character, in his whole nature, there was something attractive and elusive that disposed women towards him and enticed them. He knew that. And he himself was attracted to them by some force. Repeated experience and bitter experience, indeed, had long since taught him that every intimacy, which in the beginning lends life such pleasant diversity and presents itself as a nice and light adventure, inevitably with decent people, especially irresolute Muscovites, who are slow starters, grows into a major task, extremely complicated, and the situation finally becomes burdensome. But at every new meeting with an interesting woman, this experience somehow slipped from his memory and he wanted to live, and everything seemed quite simple and amusing. And so one time, towards evening, he was having dinner in the garden, and the lady in the beret came over unhurriedly to take the table next to his. Her expression, her walk, her dress, her hair told him that she belonged to decent society, was married, in Yalta for the first time, and alone, and that she was bored here. In the stories about the impurity of local morals there was much untruth, and he despised them, and knew that these stories were mostly invented by people who would eagerly have sinned themselves had they known how. But when the lady sat down at the next table, 3 steps away from him, he remembered these stories of easy conquests, of trips to the mountains, the tempting thought of a quick, fleeting liaison, a romance with an unknown woman of whose very name you are ignorant, suddenly took possession of him. He gently called the Spitz, and when the dog came over, he shook his finger at it. The Spitz growled. Gurov shook his finger again. The lady glanced at him and immediately lowered her eyes. "He doesn't bite," she said, and blushed. "May I give him a bone?" And when she nodded in the affirmative, he asked affably, "Have you been in Yalta long?" "About 5 days, and I'm already dragging around my 2nd week here." They were silent for a while. "The time passes quickly, and yet it's so boring here," she said, without looking at him. "It's merely the accepted thing to say it's boring here. The ordinary man lives somewhere in his Belevo or Zidra, and isn't bored. And then he comes here, ah, how boring, ah, how dusty. You'd think he came from Grenada. She laughed. Then they went on eating in silence like strangers, but after dinner they walked off together, and a light, bantering conversation began of free, contented people who do not care where they go or what they talk about. They strolled and talked of how strange the light was on the sea. The water was of a lilac color, so soft and warm, and over it the moon cast a golden strip. They talked of how sultry it was after the hot day. Gurov told her he was a Muscovite, a philologist by education, but worked in a bank. Had once been preparing to sing in an opera company, but had dropped it, owned 2 houses in Moscow, and from her he learned that she grew up in Petersburg, but was married in S, where she had been living now for 2 years, that she would be staying in Yalta for about a month, and that her husband might come to fetch her because he also wanted to get some rest. She was quite unable to explain where her husband served, in the provincial administration or the Zemstvo Council, and she herself found that funny, and Gurov also learned that her name was Anna Sergeyevna. Afterwards, in his hotel room, he thought about her, that tomorrow she would probably meet him again, and it had to be so. Going to bed, he recalled that still quite recently she had been a schoolgirl, had studied just as his daughter was studying now, recalled how much timorousness and angularity there was in her laughter, her conversation with a stranger. It must have been the first time in her life that she was alone in such a situation, when she was followed, looked at, and spoken to with only one secret purpose, which she could not fail to guess. He recalled her slender, weak neck, her beautiful gray eyes. There's something pathetic in her all the same, he thought, and began to fall asleep. A week had passed since they became acquainted. It was Sunday. Inside it was stuffy, but outside the dust flew in whirls, hats blew off. They felt thirsty all day, and Gurov often stopped at the pavilion, offering Anna Sergeyevna now a soft drink, now ice cream. There was no escape. In the evening, when it relented a little, they went to the jetty to watch the steamer come in. There were so many strollers on the pier. They had come to meet people. They were holding bouquets. And here 2 particularities of the smartly dressed Yalta crowd distinctly struck one's eye. The elderly ladies were dressed like young ones, and there were many generals. Owing to the roughness of the sea, the steamer arrived late when the sun had already gone down, and it was a long time turning before it tied up. Anna Sergeyevna looked at the ship and the passengers through her lorgnette, as if searching for acquaintances, and when she turned to Gurov, her eyes shone. She talked a lot, and her questions were abrupt, and she herself immediately forgot what she had asked. Then she lost her lorgnette in the crowd. The smartly dressed crowd was dispersing, the faces could no longer be seen, the wind had died down completely, and Gurov and Anna Sergeyevna stood as if they were expecting someone else to get off the steamer. Anna Sergeyevna was silent now and smelled the flowers, not looking at Gurov. "The weather's improved towards evening," he said. "Where shall we go now? Shall we take a drive somewhere?" She made no answer. Then he looked at her intently and suddenly embraced her and kissed her on the lips. And he was showered with the fragrance and moisture of the flowers, and at once looked around timorously. Had anyone seen them? "Let's go to your place," he said softly. And they both walked quickly. Her hotel room was stuffy and smelled of the perfumes she had bought in a Japanese shop. Gurov, looking at her now, thought, "What meetings there are in life!" From the past he had kept the memory of carefree, good-natured women, cheerful with love, grateful to him for their happiness, however brief, and of women, his wife, for example, who loved without sincerity, with superfluous talk, affectedly, with hysteria, with an expression as if it were not love, not passion, but something more significant, and of those 2 or 3 very beautiful, cold ones, in whose faces a predatory expression would suddenly flash, a stubborn wish to take, to snatch from life more than it could give. And these were women not in their first youth, capricious, unreasonable, domineering, unintelligent, and when Gurov cooled towards them, their beauty aroused hatred in him, and the lace of their underwear seemed to him like scales. But here was all the timorousness and angularity of inexperienced youth, a feeling of awkwardness and an impression of bewilderment, as if someone had suddenly knocked at the door. Anna Sergeyevna, the lady with the little dog, somehow took a special, very serious attitude towards what had happened, as if it were her fall, so it seemed, and that was strange and inopportune. Her features drooped and faded, her long hair hung down sadly on both sides of her face. She sat pondering in a dejected pose, like the sinful woman in an old painting. "It's not good," she said. "You'll be the first not to respect me now." There was a watermelon on the table in the hotel room. Gurov cut himself a slice and hurriedly began to eat it. At least half an hour passed in silence. Anna Sergeyevna was touching. She had about her a breath of the purity of a proper, naive, little experienced woman. The solitary candle burning on the table barely lit up her face. But it was clear that her heart was uneasy. "Why should I stop respecting you?" asked Gurov. "You don't know what you're saying yourself." "God forgive me," she said, and her eyes filled with tears. "This is terrible." "It's like you're justifying yourself." "How can I justify myself? I'm a bad, low woman. I despise myself. I'm not even thinking of any justification. It's not my husband I've deceived, but my own self. And not only now, I've been deceiving myself for a long time. My husband may be an honest and good man, but he's a lackey. I don't know what he does there, how he serves. I only know he's a lackey. I married him when I was 20. I was tormented by curiosity. I wanted something better. I told myself there must be a different life. I wanted to live. To live and live. I was burning with curiosity. You won't understand it, but I swear to God that I couldn't control myself any longer. Something was happening to me. I couldn't restrain myself. I told my husband I was ill, and I came here, and here I go, about, as if in a daze, as if I'm out of my mind. And now I've become a trite, trashy woman who anyone can despise." Gurov was bored listening. He was annoyed by the naive tone, by this repentance so unexpected and out of place. Had it not been for the tears in her eyes, one might have thought she was joking or playing a role. "I don't understand," he said softly. "What is it you want?" She hid her face on his chest and pressed herself to him. Believe me, I beg you," she said. "I love an honest, pure life. Sin is vile to me. I myself don't know what I'm doing. Simple people say, the unclean one beguiled me. And now I can say of myself that the unclean one has beguiled me." "Enough, enough," he muttered. He looked into her fixed, frightened eyes, kissed her, spoke softly and tenderly, and she gradually calmed down. Her gaiety returned. They both began to laugh. Later, when they went out, there was not a soul on the embankment. The town with its cypresses looked completely dead, but the sea still beat noisily against the shore. One barge was rocking on the waves, and a lantern on it glimmered sleepily. They found a cab and drove to Oreanda. "I just learned your last name downstairs in the lobby. It was written on the board." "Von Diederitz," said Gurov. "Is your husband German?" "No, his grandfather was German, I think, but he himself is Orthodox." In Oreanda they sat on a bench not far from the church, looked down on the sea, and were silent. Yalta was barely visible through the morning mist. White clouds stood motionless on the mountain tops. The leaves of the trees did not stir. Cicadas called, and the monotonous, dull noise of the sea coming from below spoke of the peace of the eternal sleep that awaits us. So it had sounded below when neither Yalta nor Oreanda were there, so it sounded now and would go on sounding with the same dull indifference when we are no longer here. And in this constancy, in this utter indifference to the life and death of each of us, there perhaps lies hidden the pledge of our eternal salvation, the unceasing movement of life on earth, of unceasing perfection. sitting beside the young woman who looked so beautiful in the dawn, appeased and enchanted by the view of this magical decor, sea, mountains, clouds, the open sky, Gurov reflected that essentially, if you thought of it, everything was beautiful in this world. Everything except for what we ourselves think and do when we forget the higher goals of being and our human dignity. Some man came up. It must have been a watchman, looked at them and went away. And this detail seemed such a mysterious thing, and also beautiful. The steamer from Feodosia could be seen approaching in the glow of the early dawn, its lights out. "There's dew on the grass," said Anna Sergeyevna, after a silence. "Yes, it's time to go home." They went back to town. And after that they met on the embankment every noon, had lunch together, dined, strolled, admired the sea. She complained that she slept poorly, that her heart beat anxiously, kept asking the same questions, troubled now by jealousy, now by fear that he did not respect her enough. And often on the square or in the garden, when there was no one near them, he would suddenly draw her to him and kiss her passionately. Their complete idleness, those kisses in broad daylight, with a furtive look around and the fear that someone else might see them. The heat, the smell of the sea, the constant flashing before their eyes of idle, smartly dressed, well-fed people, seemed to transform him. He repeatedly told Anna Sergeyevna how beautiful she was, how seductive, was impatiently passionate, never left her side, while she often brooded and kept asking him to admit that he did not respect her, did not love her at all, and only saw her a trite woman. Late almost every evening they went somewhere out of town, to Oreanda or to the Cascade. These outings were successful, their impressions each time were beautiful, majestic. They were expecting her husband to arrive. But a letter came from him in which he said that his eyes hurt and begged his wife to come home quickly. Anna Sergeyevna began to hurry. "It's good that I'm leaving," she said to Gurov. "It's fate itself." She went by carriage and he accompanied her, and they drove for a whole day. When she had taken her seat in the express train and the second bell rung, she said, "Let me have one more look at you. One more look. There." She did not cry, but was sad, as if ill, and her face trembled. "I'll think of you, remember you," she said. "God be with you. Don't think ill of me. We're saying goodbye forever. It must be so, because we should never have met. Well, God be with you." The train left quickly. Its lights soon disappeared, and a moment later the noise could no longer be heard, as if everything were conspiring on purpose to put a speedy end to this sweet oblivion, this madness. And left alone on the platform and gazing into the dark distance, Gurov listened to the chirring of the grasshoppers and the hum of the telegraph wires with a feeling as if he had just woken up. And he thought that now there was one more affair or adventure in life, and it too was now over, and all that was left was the memory. He was touched, saddened, and felt some slight remorse. This young woman whom he was never to see again had not been happy with him. He had been affectionate with her and sincere, but all the same in his treatment of her, his tone, his caresses, there had been a slight shade of mockery, the somewhat coarse arrogance of a happy man who was, moreover, almost twice her age. She had all the while called him kind, extraordinary, lofty. Obviously he had appeared to her not as he was in reality, and therefore he had involuntarily deceived her. Here at the station there was already a breath of autumn. The wind was cool. It's time I headed north too, thought Gurov, leaving the platform. High time. At home in Moscow, everything was already wintry. The stoves were heated in the morning when the children were getting ready for school and drinking their tea. It was dark and the nanny would light a lamp for a short time. The frosts were already set in. When the first snow falls on the first day of riding in sleighs, it is pleasant to see the white ground, the white roofs. One's breath feels soft and pleasant, and in those moments one remembers one's youth. The old lindens and birches, white with hoar frost, have a good-natured look. They are nearer one's heart than cypresses and palms, and near them one no longer wants to think of mountains and the sea. Gurov was a Muscovite. He returned to Moscow on a fine frosty day, and when he put on his fur coat and warm gloves and strolled down Petrovka, and when Saturday evening he heard the bells ringing, his recent trip and the places he'd visited lost all their charm for him. He gradually became immersed in Moscow life, now greedily read 3 newspapers a day and said that he never read the Moscow newspapers on principle. He was drawn to restaurants, clubs, to dinner parties, celebrations, and felt flattered that he had famous lawyers and actors among his clients, and that at the doctor's club he played cards with a professor. He could eat a whole portion of selyanka from the pan. A month would pass, and Anna Sergeyevna, as it seemed to him, would be covered by a mist in his memory and would only appear to him in dreams with a touching smile, as other women did. But more than a month passed. Deep winter came, and yet everything was as clear in his memory as if he had parted with Anna Sergeyevna only the day before. And the memories burned brighter and brighter, whether from the voices of his children doing their homework, which reached him in the study in the quiet evening, or from hearing a romance or an organ in a restaurant or a blizzard howling in the chimney. Everything would suddenly rise up in his memory. What had happened on the jetty, and the early morning with mist on the mountains, and the steamer from Fedosia, and the kisses. He would pace the room for a long time and remember and smile, and then his memories would turn to reveries, and in his imagination the past would mingle with what was still to be. Anna Sergeyevna was not a dream. She followed him everywhere, like a shadow, and watched him. Closing his eyes, he saw her as if alive, and she seemed younger, more beautiful, more tender than she was. And he also seemed better to himself than he had been then in Yalta. In the evening she gazed at him from the bookcase, the fireplace, the corner. He could hear her breathing, the gentle rustle of her skirts. In the streets he followed women with his eyes, looking for one who resembled her. And he was tormented now by a strong desire to tell someone his memories, but at home it was impossible to talk of his love, and away from home there was no one to talk with him. Certainly not among his tenants, nor at the bank, and what was there to say? Had he been in love, then? Was there anything beautiful, poetic, or instructive, or merely interesting in his relations with Anna Sergeyevna? And he found himself speaking vaguely of love, of women, and no one could guess what it was about, and only his wife raised her dark eyebrows and said, "You know, Dmitri, the role of fop does not suit you at all." One night, as he was leaving the doctor's club together with his partner, an official, he could not help himself and said, "If you only knew what a charming woman I met in Yalta." The official got into a sleigh and drove off, but suddenly turned around and called out, "Dmitri Dmitrich!" "What?" "You were right earlier. The sturgeon was a bit off." These words, so very ordinary, for some reason suddenly made Gurov indignant. struck him as humiliating, impure, such savage manners, such faces, these senseless nights and such uninteresting, unremarkable days, frenzied card-playing, gluttony, drunkenness, constant talk about the same thing, useless matters and conversations about the same thing took for their share the best part of one's time, the best of one's powers, and what was left in the end was some sort of curtailed, wingless life, some sort of nonsense, and it was impossible to get away or flee, as if you were sitting in a madhouse or a prison camp. Gurov did not sleep all night and felt indignant, and as a result had a headache all the next day. And the following nights he slept poorly, sitting up in bed all the time and thinking or pacing up and down. He was sick of the children, sick of the bank, did not want to go anywhere or talk about anything. In December, during the holidays, he got ready to travel and told his wife he was leaving for Petersburg to solicit for a young man, and went to S. Why? He did not know very well himself. He wanted to see Anna Sergeyevna, to talk with her, to arrange a meeting if he could. He arrived at S in the morning and took the best room in the hotel, where the whole floor was covered with grey army flannel, and there was an inkstand on the table, grey with dust, with a horseback rider who held his hat in his raised hand, but whose head was broken off. The hall porter gave him the necessary information. Von Diederitz lives in his own house on Staro Gonchanaraya Street, not far from the hotel. He has a good life, is wealthy, keeps his own horses. Everyone in town knows him. The porter pronounced it Dridritz. Gurov walked unhurriedly to Staro Gonchanaraya Street, found the house. Just opposite the house stretched a fence, long and grey with spikes. You could flee from such a fence, thought Gurov. Looking now at the windows, now at the fence, he reflected, today was not a work day. The husband was probably at home, and anyhow it would be tactless to go in and cause embarrassment. If he sent a message, it might fall into the husband's hands, and that would ruin everything. It would be best to trust to chance. And he kept pacing up and down the street and near the fence and waited for his chance. He saw a beggar go to the gate, saw the dogs attack him. Then an hour later he heard someone playing a piano, and the sounds reached him faintly, indistinctly. It must have been Anna Sergeyevna playing. The front door suddenly opened, and some old woman came out, the familiar Spitz running after her. Gurov wanted to call the dog, but his heart suddenly throbbed, and in his excitement he was unable to remember the Spitz's name. He paced up and down and hated the grey fence more and more, and now he thought with vexation that Anna Sergeyevna had forgotten him, was perhaps amusing herself with another man, and that was so natural in the situation of a young woman who had to look at this cursed fence from morning till evening. And he went back to his hotel room, and he sat on the sofa for a long time, not knowing what to do. Then had dinner, then took a long nap. How stupid and upsetting this all is, he thought. When he woke up and looked at the dark windows, it was already evening. So I've had my sleep. Now what am I to do for the night? He sat on the bed, which was covered with a cheap grey hospital-like blanket, and taunted himself in vexation. Here's the lady with this little dog for you. Here's an adventure for you. Yes, here you sit. That morning at the train station, a poster with the very big lettering had caught his eye. It was the opening night of The Geisha. He remembered it and went to the theater. It's very likely that she goes to opening nights, he thought. The theater was full, and here too, as in all provincial theaters, generally a haze hung over the chandeliers, the gallery stirred noisily, the local dandies stood in the front row before the performers started, their hands behind their backs, and here too, in the governor's box, the governor's daughter sat in front wearing a boa, while the governor himself mostly hid behind the portiere, and only his hands could be seen. The curtains swayed, the orchestra spent a long time tuning up. All the while the public came in and took their seats. Gurov kept searching greedily with his eyes. Anna Sergeyevna came in. She sat in the third row, and when Gurov looked at her, his heart was wrung. He realized clearly that there was now no person closer, dearer, or more important for him in the whole world. This small woman, lost in the provincial crowd, not remarkable for anything, with a vulgar lorgnette in her hand, now filled his whole life. Was his grief, his joy, the only happiness he now wished for himself, and to the sounds of the bad orchestra, with its trashy local violins, he thought how beautiful she was. He thought and dreamed. A man came in with Anna Sergeyevna and sat down next to her. A young man with little side whiskers, very tall, stooping. He nodded his head at every step, and it seemed he was perpetually bowing. This was probably her husband, whom she, in an outburst of bitter feeling that time in Yalta, had called a lackey. And indeed, in his long figure, his side whiskers, his little bald spot, there was something of a lackeyish modesty. He had a sweet smile. The badge of some learned society gleamed in his buttonhole like the badge of a lackey. During the first intermission, the husband went to smoke. She remained in her seat. Gurov, who was also sitting in the stalls, went up to her and said in a trembling voice with a forced smile, "How do you do?" She looked at him and paled, then looked again in horror, not believing her eyes, and tightly clutched her fan and lorgnette in her hand, obviously struggling with herself to keep from fainting, but were silent. Both were silent. She sat, he stood, alarmed at her confusion, not venturing to sit down next to her. The tuning-up violins and flutes sang out, and suddenly it became frightening. It seemed the people were gazing at them from all the boxes, but then she got up and quickly walked to the exit. He followed her, and they both went confusedly through the corridors and stairways, going up, then down, and the uniforms of the courts, the schools, the imperial estates flashed before them, all with badges. Ladies flashed by, fur coats on hangers, a drafty wind blew, drenching them with the smell of cigar stubs, and Gurov, whose heart was pounding, thought, "Oh Lord, why these people, this orchestra?" And just then he suddenly recalled how, at the station in the evening after he had seen Anna Sergeyevna off, he had said to himself that everything was over, that they would never see each other again. But how far it still was from being over. On a narrow, dark stairway with the sign, "To the Amphitheater," she stopped. "How you frightened me," she said, breathing heavily, still pale, stunned. "Oh, how you frightened me! I'm barely alive! Why did you come? Why? But understand, Anna, understand," he said in a low voice, hurrying. "I beg you to understand." She looked at him with fear, with entreaty, with love. Looked at him intently, the better to keep his features in her memory. "I've been suffering so," she went on, not listening to him. "I think only of you, all the time. I've lived by my thoughts of you. I've tried to forget, but why? Why did you come?" Further up on the landing, the two high school boys were smoking and looking down, but Gurov did not care. He drew Anna Sergeyevna to him and began kissing her face, her cheeks, her hands, her neck. "What are you doing? What are you doing?" she repeated in horror, pushing him away from her. "We've both lost our minds. Leave today. Leave at once. I adjure you by all that's holy. I implore you. Somebody's coming." Somebody was climbing the stairs. "You must leave," Anna Sergeyevna went on in a whisper. "Do you hear, Dmitri Dmitrich? I will come to you in Moscow. I've never been happy. I'm unhappy now. I'll never be happy. Never. Don't make me suffer still more. I swear I'll come to Moscow. But we must part now, my dear, my good one, my darling. We must part." She pressed his hand and quickly began going downstairs, turning back to him now, and it was clear from her eyes that she was indeed not happy. Gurov stood for a little while, listened, and then, when everything was quiet, found his coat and left the theater. And Anna Sergeyevna began coming to see him in Moscow. Once every 2 or 3 months, she left S, told her husband she was going to consult a professor about her female disorder, and her husband did and did not believe her. Arriving in Moscow, she stayed at the Slavyansky Bazaar and at once sent a man in a red hat to Gurov. Gurov came to see her, and nobody in Moscow knew of it. Once he was going to see her in that way on a winter morning, and the messenger had come the previous evening but had not found him in. With him was his daughter, whom he wanted to see off to school, which was on the way, but big wet snow was falling. "It is now 3 degrees above freezing, and yet it's snowing," Gurov said to his daughter, "but it's warm only near the surface of the earth. Above, while the upper layers of the atmosphere, the temperature is quite different." "And why is there no thunder in winter, Papa?" He explained that too. He spoke and thought that here he was going to have a rendezvous. Not a single soul knew about it, or probably would ever know. He had 2 lives. An apparent one, seen and known by all who needed it, filled with conventional truth and conventional deceit, which perfectly resembled the lives of his acquaintances and friends, and another that went on in secret. And by some strange coincidence, perhaps an accidental one, everything that he found important, interesting, necessary, in which he was sincere and did not deceive himself, which constituted the core of his life, occurred in secret from others, while everything that made up his lie, his shell, in which he had worked to conceal, in which he had hid in order to conceal the truth. For instance, his work at the bank, his arguments at the club, his inferior race, his attending official celebrations with his wife. All of this was in full view. And he judged others by himself, did not believe what he saw, always supposed that every man led his own real and very interesting life under the cover of secrecy, as under the cover of night. Every personal existence was upheld by a secret, and it was perhaps partly for that reason that every cultivated man took such anxious care that his personal secret should be respected. After taking his daughter to school, Gurov went to the Slavyansky Bazaar. He took his fur coat off downstairs, went up, knocked softly at the door. Anna Sergeyevna, wearing his favorite gray dress, tired from the trip and the expectation, had been waiting for him since the previous evening. She was pale, looked at him, and did not smile. He had barely come in when she was already leaning on his chest. Their kiss was long, lingering, as if they had not seen each other for 2 years. "Well, how is your life there?" he asked. "What's new?" "Wait, I'll tell you." I can't." She could not speak because she was crying. She turned away from him and pressed a handkerchief to her eyes. "Well, let her cry a little, and meanwhile I'll sit down," he thought, and sat down in an armchair. Then he rang and ordered tea. And then, while he drank tea, she went out, standing with her face turned to the window. She was crying from anxiety, from a sorrowful awareness that their life had turned out so sadly. They only saw each other in secret. They hid from people like thieves. Was their life not broken? "Well, stop now," he said. For him it was obvious that this love of theirs would not end soon, that there was no knowing when. Anna Sergeyevna's attachment to him grew even stronger. She adored him, and it would have been unthinkable to tell her that it all really had to end at some point, and she would not have believed it. He went up to her and took her by the shoulders to caress her, to make a joke. Man walks into a bar with a giraffe. And at that moment he saw himself in the mirror. His head was beginning to turn gray, and it seemed strange to him that he had aged so much in those last years, had lost so much of his good looks. The shoulders on which his hands lay were warm and trembled. He felt compassion for this life, still so warm and beautiful, but probably never near the point where it would begin to fade and wither like his own life. Why did she love him so? Women had always taken him to be other than he was, and they had loved him, not himself, but a man their imagination had created, whom they had greedily sought all their lives, and then when they had noticed their mistake, they had still loved him. And not one of them had been happy with him. Time passed. He met women, became intimate, parted, but not once did he love. There was anything else, but not love. And only now, when his head was gray, had he really fallen in love as he ought to, for the first time in his life. He and Anna Sergeyevna loved each other like very close, dear people, like husband and wife, like tender friends. It seemed to them that fate itself had destined them for each other, and they could not understand why he had a wife and she a husband, and it was as if they were two birds of passage, a male and a female, who had been caught and forced to live in separate cages. They had forgiven each other the things they were ashamed of in the past. They forgave everything in the present, and they felt that this love of theirs had changed them both. Had changed them both. Formerly, in sad moments, he had calmed himself with all sorts of arguments, whatever had come into his head, but now he did not care about any arguments. He felt deep compassion. He wanted to be sincere, tender. "Stop, my good one," he said. "You've had your cry. And although, let's talk now. We'll think up something." They had a long discussion, talked about how to rid themselves of the need for hiding, for deception, for living in different towns, and not seeing each other for long periods. How could they free themselves from these unbearable bonds? How, he asked, clutching his head. How? And it seemed that just a little more, and the solution would be found, and then a new, beautiful life would begin, and it was clear to both of them that the end was still far, far off, and that the most complicated and difficult part was just beginning.